The emergency ward was a pressure cooker of sterile air and rhythmic alarms. A high-profile patient was fading fast, and the hospital's top surgical team was hitting a brick wall. Every protocol had been followed. Every test was inconclusive. But the vitals continued their terrifying descent. In an unprecedented move, the chief of medicine barked an order that chilled the room. "Call in the SEAL medics." Everyone froze, waiting for the elite specialist to save the day. No one noticed the quiet nurse in the corner, staring at the monitors with a predatory focus until the SEALs arrived, and looked at her with a respect that changed everything. Truth made manifest. Elena Ward was 32 years old, and in the high-stakes, adrenaline-soaked hierarchy of Metropolitan General, she was essentially a ghost. She worked the graveyard shifts where the air was heavy with the smell of industrial cleaner and the unspoken weight of broken stories. To her colleagues, Elena was just a reliable regular. A quiet woman in navy blue scrubs who finished her charts with obsessive precision and never joined the loud, ego-driven banter in the break room. They saw her as competent, yes, but effectively invisible. A background character in a theater dominated by medical rock stars who thrived on the chaos of the sirens. The trauma bay was currently a storm of activity. The patient, a man who had survived a complex structural collapse, was a medical black box. His heart rate was erratic, his blood pressure was a roller coaster, and his oxygen saturation was dipping for reasons no one could explain. Dr. Sterling, the lead attending, was a man who lived for the spotlight, but today the spotlight was burning him. He had tried 3 different stabilization methods, and each one had failed. The frustration in the room was a physical weight, pressing against the lungs of everyone present. The fluorescent lights hummed with a low-frequency buzz that most people ignored, but to Elena, it was the rhythm of a system under strain. She noticed the tiny details, the way a supply cart was vibrating, or the slight scent of ozone coming from an aging monitor. She was a creature of total awareness, trained to detect the smallest anomalies in her environment before they turned into catastrophes. She watched the night shift staff moving with a practiced but slightly loose discipline. She saw the micro-lags in their response times and the way they prioritized the loudest patients over the quietest ones. To Elena, a patient who had stopped screaming was far more dangerous than one who was still making noise. She understood the silence of the threshold, the moment a body stops fighting and starts surrendering. She watched the senior residents move with a frantic, heroic energy that would have looked impressive on a TV drama, but to her it looked like a train wreck in slow motion. "We've checked the arterial lines, we've run the tox screen, and the scans are clear," Sterling shouted, his hands shaking slightly as he wiped sweat from his brow. "He should be stabilizing, but he's crashing. What are we missing?" Elena stood at the foot of the bed. She wasn't part of the decision-making circle. She was the support staff, the one who ensured the IV bags were full and the gauze was ready. But she was the only one who hadn't moved her eyes from the patient's chest for the last 40 minutes. She noticed a tiny, almost imperceptible lag in the rise of his left rib cage, a pattern that didn't show up on the digital monitors because the machines weren't looking for rhythm. They were only looking for numbers. She saw a subtle rhythmic twitch in the patient's carotid artery that didn't match his heart rate on the screen, a whisper of a brewing disaster that the standard hospital protocols often missed in the initial rush of the golden hour. The decision to call the SEAL medics wasn't common. It was a last resort for cases involving complex trauma that defied standard civilian medicine. Injuries often seen in high-pressure field conditions rather than a sterile OR. The hospital staff began to pull back, their energy shifting from action to anticipation. They were waiting for the experts, the men who worked in the shadows of the military's most elite units. During this lull, Elena remained at the bedside. She adjusted the patient's head position slightly, her movements as fluid and silent as a shadow. A junior resident brushed past her, nearly knocking her clipboard over. "Stay out of the splash zone, nurse," he muttered, not even looking at her face. Elena didn't react. She didn't roll her eyes or defend her space. She simply moved back 3 inches and continued her observation. She lived in the silence, waiting for the moment when the noise would finally fail. And she knew that moment was coming in exactly 60 seconds. The silence of the shadow. In the hierarchy of the elite, volume is often mistaken for authority, and speed is often mistaken for competence. Elena understood that true leadership is a service, not a status symbol. It is the refusal to let noise distract from the objective. She knew that the person closest to the problem is often the one who sees the truth first. They were so busy looking for a miracle from the outside that they forgot to look at the reality inside the room. Elena Ward lived in that silence, waiting for the moment when the truth would finally demand a voice. She knew that truth didn't care about titles. It only cared about the heartbeat. If you think the closest observer is often the least heard, comment. That is unfair. The atmosphere in the trauma bay shifted the moment the announcement echoed through the intercom. Specialized Tactical Medical Unit is entering the North Wing. The pace of the hospital team slowed down. There was a collective exhale of relief mixed with a touch of professional insecurity. They were the best of the best in the city, and they had just been told they weren't enough. Dr. Sterling stood by the entrance, adjusting his white coat, preparing to hand over the failure to someone who could handle the heat. The residents whispered about the legendary shadow medics, men who could perform surgery in the back of a moving Humvee under heavy fire. They believed that the solution was coming from the outside. They believed that the titles of the SEALs would provide an answer that their own degrees couldn't find. In the middle of this organized waiting, Elena Ward was still working. While the others were looking at the door, she was looking at the patient's fingernails. She noticed a subtle shift in the color, not the blue of standard hypoxia, but a strange mottled purple that spoke of a very specific type of vascular feedback loop. It was a sign of refractory pressure, a condition where the body's internal sensors are being tricked by an atmospheric shift. She saw the silent cyanosis, a sign that the oxygen wasn't just low, it was being physically blocked by internal atmospheric pressure. The medical fog of war had descended on the room. It's a psychological state where the brain, overwhelmed by too many conflicting signals, starts to ignore the critical data in favor of the loud data. Sterling was staring at the heart rate, but he was ignoring the skin temperature. He was shouting for meds, but he was ignoring the rhythm of the mechanical ventilator. He was throwing hammers at a problem that required a needle. She had seen this before. She knew the pattern. It wasn't a heart problem, and it wasn't a lung problem. It was a transition problem. But Elena also knew the politics of the room. If she spoke now, she would be dismissed as overstepping. She was just a nurse, and the SEALs were on their way. Why would anyone listen to the ghost when the gods were coming? She realized that if they pushed more saline now, the internal pressure would burst the microvessels in the patient's lungs. They were literally drowning him from the inside out while trying to save him. She watched as the team began to disconnect secondary monitors to make room for the tactical gear. "Let's keep the lines clear for the unit," Sterling commanded. "We don't want to get in their way." Elena felt a pang of frustration, but she kept her face as neutral as a stone wall. She saw the patient's pulse oximeter flicker. 88, 86, 84. The golden hour was shrinking to a silver minute. The team was so focused on the process of receiving help that they were losing the patient they were trying to help. It was the expert paradox, where the belief in a higher authority makes everyone else stop thinking for themselves. It was cognitive overload, the moment a brilliant mind shuts down because it's trying to process too much noise at once. Elena reached out and checked the manual pulse at the femoral artery. It was thready, jumping like a trapped bird. She knew that if they didn't adjust the thoracic pressure in the next 5 minutes, the patient would enter a refractory period he wouldn't come back from. She looked at the door, then at the clock, then at the man dying on the table. She realized that speed without awareness is just a faster way to fail. She saw the 3-millimeter lag in the rise of the right chest wall. It wasn't a heart problem. It was a tension leak from the blast. The silence of the room was interrupted only by the rhythmic beep of the monitor, which was now sounding a low saturation alarm. No one moved to fix it. They were all ears for the heavy boots they knew were coming. They were waiting for an answer, ignoring the fact that the question was being answered right in front of them by the patient's own body. Elena realized that in a world of loud experts, the truth is often a whisper that gets drowned out by the anticipation of a roar. She adjusted the oxygen flow by 2 liters, not enough to cause a fuss, but enough to buy the man another 60 seconds. She was the anchor the room didn't know it had, a master of the baseline, waiting for the storm to break. If you realize we often wait for answers instead of seeing what's already there, comment, "I was wrong." The double doors of the trauma bay swung open with a heavy rhythmic thud. 2 men in tactical multicam vests over navy blue fatigues marched in. They didn't look like doctors. They looked like operators. Their gear was soot-stained, and their movements were synchronized with a terrifying efficiency. The leader, a man named Jax with eyes like cold flint, stopped at the foot of the bed. Dr. Sterling stepped forward, his voice taking on a subservient tone. "Commanders, thank you for coming. We've administered the standard trauma bundle, but the hemodynamic instability is persisting. We think it's a localized vascular collapse." Jax didn't look at Sterling. He didn't even acknowledge the white coat. He took in the entire room in 3 seconds. He looked at the blood on the floor, the readings on the screen, and then his eyes scanned the faces of the staff. When his gaze landed on the quiet nurse in the corner, he stopped. The atmosphere in the room didn't just change, it inverted. The room went deathly silent. Jax didn't move toward the patient first. He took 2 steps toward Elena Ward. Jax watched her hands, seeing the ghost of the battlefield medic he had heard about in classified briefings. The one they called the Raven in the desert. He saw her combat master stance, the look of a professional who was caged by amateurs. "You've been with the patient since intake?" Jax asked. His voice wasn't a bark. It was a low, resonant question that carried the weight of a professional directive. Elena looked up, her green eyes meeting his with a stillness that matched his own. "Yes, 42 minutes, she replied. "What do you see?" Jax asked. The hospital staff gasped. Sterling's jaw practically hit the floor. The god of the field was asking the invisible nurse for a diagnosis before he even touched the patient. It was a violation of every social rule in the hospital, but in Jax's world, those rules didn't exist. Only the truth of the field mattered. Jax felt a primal reflex of obedience trigger in his brain when he saw her. He realized that the woman in front of him wasn't an amateur. She was an operator. Elena didn't waste a single heartbeat. She didn't stutter, and she didn't apologize for her opinion. She spoke with a crystalline clarity that cut through the confusion of the last hour. The time for nursing etiquette was over. The time for the combat master protocol had arrived. "It's not a collapse, and it's not an infection," Elena said, stepping into the center of the light. "It's a diaphragmatic tension leak from the blast simulation. Look at the subcostal lag on the left side. He's not hypoxic because of his lungs. He's hypoxic because the atmospheric pressure in his thoracic cavity is mirroring the simulation environment. He's trapped in a pressure loop. If you vent the chest at the second intercostal space, the rhythm will reset." She didn't use medical jargon to sound smart. She used the language of the physics of survival. She reached for a large bore, 14-gauge needle from the sterile tray. She didn't wait for a sterile drape, and she didn't wait for a signature. She felt the space between the second and third ribs with a mechanical, cold precision. Jax looked at the patient's chest, saw the micro-lag Elena had pointed out, and gave a sharp single nod. "She's right," Jax announced to his teammate. "Let's prep for a needle decompression. Move!" The SEAL medics moved with a speed that made the residents look like they were standing still. They didn't ask for a second opinion. They didn't wait for a scan. They trusted the nurse's eyes more than the hospital's million-dollar machines. A sharp, audible hiss of trapped air, like a tire blowing out, whistled out of the patient's chest. It was the sound of a life returning. On the monitor, the flat line began to spike instantly. 10, 20, 60, 80. A junior doctor whispered to Jax as he prepped the tray. Sir, how did you know to ask her? She's one of our floor nurses. Jack stopped for a microsecond, looking at the doctor with a gaze of profound disappointment. She's not just anything. Elena Ward was the lead field support medic for the Shadow Divisions in the Red Sector for 8 years. She wrote the field manual for the 2018 update. Half the men in my unit are alive because she saw things in the dirt that we couldn't see in the light. If she's in the room, she's the authority. You were just too busy looking at her uniform to see her rank. The truth hit the room like a physical shock. The invisible nurse was a legend in a world they couldn't even imagine. The words combat master carried a weight that no doctoral degree could match. It meant she had operated under heavy fire. It meant she had made life and death decisions when the sky was literally falling. She wasn't standing in the corner because she was weak. She was standing there because she had seen enough blood to know that silence is the best way to hear a heartbeat. The atmosphere inverted. The master was standing in the center of the light. If you believe experience is about what you've seen, not what you're called, comment, "I am indebted." The procedure took less than 60 seconds. As Jax drove the large bore needle into the thoracic cavity, a sharp, audible hiss of trapped air whistled out of the patient's chest, the sound of a life returning. On the monitor, the oxygen saturation began a steady, healthy climb. 88, 92, 96, 98. The heart rate began to climb instantly. The flat, jagged lines began to spike into healthy peaks. 10, 20, 60, 80. The patient's heart rate stabilized, the erratic spikes smoothing out into a rhythmic, comforting pulse. The black box had been solved, and the answer had been in the room the entire time, hidden in plain sight behind a pair of tired eyes and a quiet demeanor. The surgery to permanently repair the lung injury and the underlying vascular damage was successful. The tension in the trauma bay had faded, replaced by a heavy, reflective silence that hung over the night shift like a protective shroud. Dr. Sterling stood in the corner, his hero persona completely deflated. He realized that he had spent 40 minutes looking for a complex, rare disease because he wanted a grand save, while Elena had found the answer in the first 5 minutes by simply paying attention to the man. He felt the weight of his own arrogance pressing down on his chest. He was replaying the last hour over and over in his mind like a broken film strip. He saw the moment his own ego had nearly cost a hero his life. The hospital at 4 a.m. is a strange liminal space where the line between life and death feels remarkably thin. Elena stood in the break room, the cold coffee in her hand doing little to combat the leaden weight in her bones. She wasn't replaying her success. She was already analyzing the next transition. To her, the combat master moment was just a necessary adjustment in a failing system, a correction in the flow of time. "We were looking too far," Sterling admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "We were looking for the impossible, and we missed the obvious. I'm sorry I didn't listen to you, Elena. I'm sorry I was loud." Elena gave a small, tired nod. "It happens to the best of us. Pressure creates tunnel vision. That's why we have a team. And that's why we have protocols that bypass the ego. Don't let it happen again, doctor. Next time, there won't be a shadow in the room to catch the fall." Jax wiped his hands and turned toward Elena, ignoring the apology from the doctor. He had washed the soot and blood from his face, revealing a deeply weathered expression of profound respect. He stood at full attention, clicked his boots, and gave her a sharp, formal military salute. "Sergeant Major Ward," Jax said, using her old rank. "I owe you my brother's life. The Red Sector still misses you. You should think about coming back to the tactical wing. We need eyes like yours." Elena didn't return the salute. She was a civilian now, and those days were in her past. But she acknowledged it with a dignity that settled the matter forever. "I like the quiet of the night shift, Jax, but I appreciate the offer. Make sure he finishes the full 3-week recovery cycle before you put him back in the dirt. If I see him in my ER again, I'll tell his mother." As the SEALs packed their gear to leave, the trauma bay remained eerily silent. The frantic energy was gone, replaced by a heavy, reflective atmosphere. The staff looked at Elena differently now. They didn't see the gray scrubs or the messy bun. They saw the raven, the ghost who had straightened the world when it started to tilt toward tragedy. She was back at her desk, quietly filing her paperwork as if nothing extraordinary had happened. She didn't want the spotlight. She was the code whisperer. One of the senior nurses, the one who had earlier told Elena to stay out of the way, walked up to her. She didn't say much, but she handed Elena a cup of fresh coffee. I had no idea," the nurse whispered. Elena took the cup, her expression returning to its neutral, professional baseline. "It's okay. Pressure makes everyone a little short-sighted. The patient is stable. That's the only thing that counts." She was a professional who knew that real respect isn't given because of a title on a door. It's earned in the 4 seconds when everyone else is looking away. If you believe the right answer is sometimes already in the room, comment, "I will live kindly." The story of Elena Ward reminds us that true greatness is often found in the people we choose not to notice. We live in a world that is obsessed with stars, the ones who take up the most space, the ones who shout the loudest into microphones, and the ones who crave the bright spotlight for their own ego. We assume that because someone is quiet, they have nothing to say, and because someone is in the background, they have nothing to offer the front lines. But true mastery is a silent thing. It's a fire that burns in the bones, forged in the heat of impossible experience and the discipline of relentless observation. It is the ability to see the invisible threads of a crisis before they knot into a disaster. Elena understood that true leadership is a service, not a status symbol. Her silence was her strength, and her strength was the patient's salvation. Combat Master isn't a title you put on a business card or a LinkedIn profile. It's a level of awareness that allows you to see the shadow pattern in the middle of a storm. It's the rare ability to keep your pulse steady and your mind clear when everyone else's is racing at 100 beats per minute. It is the quiet power of being the fixed point in a world that is spinning out of control. Value doesn't lie in your position on an organizational chart. It lies in your perspective. Elena didn't know more than the surgeons in terms of academic theory. She simply saw the reality differently. She saw the connections between the dots that everyone else was treating as isolated incidents. She understood that in a crisis, the person closest to the problem is often the one with the most valuable information, provided they have the courage to speak up when it matters most. She proved that leadership is not about having the podium. It's about having the answer when no one else does. Elena Ward wasn't a superhero with a cape. She was a professional who refused to let her position define her contribution. She dared to trust her eyes when the machines were telling everyone else a different story. And that courage is what made the difference between a tragedy and a miracle. We often overlook the quiet professionals in our own lives, the colleagues who stay in the shadows, the mentors who listen far more than they speak. We judge them by their scrubs, not realizing they are carrying medals and histories we can't begin to imagine. The next time you find yourself in a room where the experts are failing, look for the person in the corner who has been watching the baseline. Look for the quiet observer who has seen the patterns that others deem too small to notice. They might just be the shadow medic you need to get home alive. They might just be the only reason the whole world keeps spinning while everyone else is seeking attention. Elena went back to her quiet life after that night. She continued to drink her tea. She continued to do her charts, but she was no longer invisible. She was the fixed point. Real leadership is clear. Real expertise is humble. And real heroes don't care if you ever know their names. They only care that the mission is complete and the people are safe in their beds. Be the observer. Be the master of your own pressure. And remember, the calmest voice in the room is often the one that saves the world from its own noise. That is the power of the combat master. That is the truth. Because in the end, it's not what people say about you that defines your legacy. It's what the world becomes because you were there. Even if you stayed in the shadows until you were called to save a life. That is the eternal lesson of the Raven. If you believe the people who quietly understand what others don't and speak when it matters, deserve recognition, leave a comment below. And if this story reminds you that sometimes the answer isn't coming, It's already there. Don't forget to subscribe for more.